there comes a moment in life when you stop asking, why does this keep happening to me? And you begin asking, what is this trying to teach me? You attract what you are willing to tolerate, even when you are not fully aware of it. This does not mean you consciously choose pain or disrespect, but it means that on a deeper level, you allow certain behaviors to remain in your life longer than they should. Every time you ignore a red flag, every time you silence your intuition, every time you accept less than what feels right, you are setting a standard. And that standard quietly tells others how to treat you. At first, it may not seem like much. A small lie, a moment of disrespect, a lack of effort. You tell yourself it is nothing. You justify it. You give them another chance. But what you are really doing is teaching them that this behavior is acceptable. Not through your words, but through your silence. Not through confrontation, but through your willingness to stay. And the more you tolerate, the more it continues, because people rarely rise above the standards you set. They meet you where you stand. If you stand in self-doubt, you will meet those who reinforce it. If you stand in uncertainty, you will meet those who take advantage of it. If you stand without boundaries, you will meet those who cross them without hesitation. This is why the same type of person keeps appearing in different forms. It feels like bad luck, but it is often a repeated pattern. The faces change, but the experience remains familiar. Not because the world is against you, but because the internal standard has not yet changed. There is also a quiet fear underneath all of this. The fear of losing someone, the fear of being alone, the fear that if you walk away, there will be no one else, and so you stay. You compromise, you shrink your expectations just to keep the connection alive. But in doing so, you slowly disconnect from yourself. Over time, this becomes normal. Disrespect feels familiar. Inconsistency feels expected. You begin to confuse emotional struggle with love. And without realizing it, you start accepting what once would have been unacceptable. Until one day, you begin to notice the pattern. You begin to see that it was never just about them. It was about what you allowed, what you overlooked, and what you convinced yourself to endure. And in that awareness, something begins to shift. Potholes do not begin with other people. They begin within you, often in places you have not fully explored. What you experience repeatedly in relationships is not random. It is shaped by your past, your emotional conditioning, and the beliefs you quietly carry about yourself and others. These patterns operate beneath the surface, guiding your choices without asking for your permission. You may find yourself drawn to the same type of person again and again. Someone distant, unavailable, inconsistent, or in need of fixing. On the surface, it feels like chemistry or connection. But underneath, there is familiarity, and familiarity is powerful, even when it is unhealthy. The mind often chooses what feels known over what is actually right. Many of these patterns are rooted in early experiences. The way you were treated, the love you received or lacked, the environment you grew up in, all of it leaves an imprint. If love once felt uncertain, you may now associate love with instability. If attention had to be earned, you may now feel the need to prove your worth in every relationship. These are not conscious decisions, but they shape how you connect, what you accept, and what you chase. Unhealed wounds also create emotional blind spots. You may ignore red flags because part of you is trying to relive a familiar story and finally change its ending. You may stay in situations that drain you because leaving feels like failure. You may confuse intensity with depth, attachment with connection, or longing with love. And so the cycle continues, not because you do not see it, but because something within you still resonates with it. There is also the tendency to look outward for answers, to analyze the other person, to question their behavior, to try to understand why they are the way they are. But the deeper question often remains untouched. Why does this feel familiar? Why does this feel acceptable? Why does this pattern continue to repeat, even when the outcome is always the same? Until these internal patterns are brought into awareness, they will continue to shape your experiences. Different people will enter your life, but the emotional dynamic will feel strangely similar. The details may change, but the core remains the same, quietly guided by beliefs and wounds that have not yet been fully understood. Self-awareness begins the moment you stop looking outward for explanations and turn your attention inward. It is not comfortable and it is not easy because it requires honesty without excuses. Instead of asking why others behave the way they do, you begin to ask why you respond the way you do, why you stay when something feels wrong, why you ignore what you clearly see, why you continue to invest in what repeatedly drains you. At first, the mind resists this shift. It is easier to point at someone else's behavior than to examine your own patterns. It is easier to label others as the problem than to recognize your role in allowing certain dynamics to continue. But self-awareness is not about blame. It is about clarity. It is about seeing things as they are, without distortion, without denial. You start to notice your triggers, the moments when you feel anxious, when you overthink, when you seek reassurance. You begin to observe how quickly you abandon your own needs to maintain connection, how often you silence your voice to avoid conflict. These are not random reactions. They are conditioned responses, shaped over time, repeating automatically until you become aware of them. With awareness, a space begins to form between what you feel and how you act. Before, everything was immediate. A message delayed would create anxiety. A shift in behavior would lead to overthinking. But now you pause. You observe. You question whether your reaction is coming from the present moment or from something unresolved. Within you, this awareness also reveals the patterns in your choices. You begin to see how you are drawn to certain traits, certain dynamics, certain emotional experiences, not because they are right for you, but because they are familiar. And once you see this clearly, you can no longer pretend that it is just coincidence. There is a quiet power in recognizing your own patterns, not to judge yourself, but to understand yourself. Because what you understand, you can begin to change. And what you remain unaware of will continue to control you. As awareness deepens, your decisions begin to shift, not out of force, but out of clarity. You start to choose differently, not because you are trying to fix your life, but because you finally see it clearly. Choosing yourself is not a single decision. It is something you practice in quiet, consistent moments. It shows in the way you respond to what once weakened your boundaries. It shows in what you no longer accept, even when a part of you still feels the urge to hold on. This choice is not loud or dramatic. It is often invisible to others, but deeply felt within. In the past, you may have placed others at the center of your world. Their attention determined your mood. Their presence gave you a sense of worth. And without realizing it, you began to abandon parts of yourself just to maintain connection. You adjusted your standards, ignored your needs, and convinced yourself that this was necessary for love to stay. But something begins to shift when you start choosing yourself. You no longer seek validation in the same way. You no longer wait for someone else to define your value. Instead, you begin to build a relationship with yourself that does not depend on anyone's approval. And from this place, your tolerance changes. Situations that once felt acceptable now feel heavy. Conversations that once felt normal now feel draining. You begin to notice the difference between connection that nourishes you and connection that slowly takes from you. And with this awareness, your responses become different, not reactive, not emotional in the same way, but grounded and clear. You begin to walk away earlier, not out of anger, but out of understanding. You no longer need things to fall apart before you let go. A lack of respect is enough. Inconsistency is enough. Misalignment is enough. Because you are no longer trying to force something to work at the cost of your own peace. Choosing yourself also means allowing space where there used to be noise. You may spend more time alone, but it no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like stability. It feels like returning to something that was always there, but often ignored. And in that space, your clarity strengthens. As this becomes your way of being, the people you attract begin to change. Not because you are trying to find different people, but because you are no longer available for the same dynamics. What once felt familiar no longer feels right, and what once felt out of reach begins to align naturally with who you have become. And so, you begin to understand something that once felt unclear. It was never about chasing the right person. It was about becoming the version of yourself that no longer accepts the wrong ones. Because when you change within, your outer world cannot remain the same. The connections you once held onto will no longer feel aligned. The patterns that once repeated will quietly dissolve, not because you forced them to end, because you are no longer the same person who needed them. There is a certain peace that comes with this realization, a calm strength that does not need to prove anything, does not need to chase anything, does not need to hold on to what is not meant to stay. You stop asking, will they choose me? And instead, you ask, does this align with who I am becoming? And that question changes everything, because now you are no longer searching for someone to complete you. You are standing complete and allowing only what reflects that wholeness to enter your life. So be patient with your journey. The awareness you have gained, patterns you have started to see, boundaries you are learning to set. This is the real transformation. And as you continue walking this path, you will notice something quietly powerful. The wrong people stop finding a place in your life. Not because they disappeared from the world, because you finally disappeared from the version of yourself that once welcomed them. And in that moment, without force, without struggle, you are free.